"Yes, officers. There's a young black kid here causing trouble in the neighborhood." These words, laced with a venomous certainty, hung in the thick, humid air of a late afternoon on Rosewood Drive. The piercing wail of police sirens was a foreign sound in this enclave of manicured lawns and feigned tranquility, their red and blue lights flashing erratically, painting the pristine suburban landscape in ominous, pulsating hues. "Put your hands where we can see them." Officer Blake's voice, sharp and unnecessarily aggressive, sliced through the quiet evening. He looked at 9-year-old Marcus Jordan as if the boy were already a convicted felon, a hardened criminal caught in the act of some unspeakable crime. The basketball, a brand new Spalding, slipped from Marcus's small hands. It bounced once, a hollow thud on the asphalt, before rolling into the gutter, forgotten. Standing on her perfectly manicured lawn, a testament to her obsessive control, was Karen White, a 45-year-old woman whose life revolved around maintaining the superficial perfection of her surroundings. She was the one who had made the call. Her designer athleisure outfit, a uniform of the privileged and bored, likely cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her manicured finger, a weapon of false accusation, was pointed directly at Marcus, who wore nothing more threatening than a Chicago Bulls jersey number 23. Of course, and the bewildered expression of a child whose world had just been violently upended. Marcus slowly raised his hands, his movements careful and deliberate, a sad pantomime taught to him by his parents, a lesson black children across America learn far too young. But what was about to unfold would shock everyone present, including the 2 officers who believed they were responding to just another routine call about a suspicious black kid in a white neighborhood. What none of them knew, what Karen, in her blind prejudice, could never have imagined, was that the quiet phone call Marcus had made just moments before would summon a force to Rosewood Drive that would shatter their carefully constructed world. A man would arrive who would not only expose Karen's web of lies, but also challenge the officer's ingrained assumptions and prove that sometimes justice doesn't just arrive, it descends with the force of a legend. The events of that evening on Rosewood Drive would become a stark lesson about the insidious power of assumptions, the devastating consequences of racism, and the shocking, world-altering truth about who Marcus Jordan really was. To fully comprehend the magnitude of this moment, we must rewind 3 weeks to a sun-drenched Saturday morning when 9-year-old Marcus Jordan first set foot on Rosewood Drive. He was blissfully unaware that this move, a temporary stay with his grandmother, would place him directly in the crosshairs of a woman whose simmering hatred was about to boil over and consume her, nearly destroying him in the process. Marcus was staying at his grandmother Dolores's house, while his mother, Juanita, was overseas handling business for the family's philanthropic foundation. The house at 247 Rosewood Drive was a beautiful, albeit more modest, home than Marcus was used to. It had a large, inviting driveway, perfect for shooting hoops, and a sprawling front yard where he could practice his dribbling, the rhythmic bounce of the ball a constant, comforting presence. You see, Marcus wasn't just any 9-year-old. He was a special kid, intelligent and perceptive beyond his years. He was the kind of child who said yes ma'am and no sir, without needing to be reminded, who would offer to help elderly neighbors with their groceries, and who dreamed, with every fiber of his being, of one day playing in the NBA, just like his dad. His report cards were a sea of A's, his teachers adored him, and his smile, a smaller, brighter version of his father's famous grin, could light up any room. But there was an aura of mystery surrounding Marcus's family, a level of fame so immense that even he didn't fully grasp its implications. His father, Michael Jordan, was more than just a retired basketball player. He was a global icon, a brand, a legend. His days were filled with board meetings, endorsement deals, and the constant, crushing weight of being one of the most famous people on the planet. He was often away on business, leaving in the pre-dawn hours in a fleet of black cars, looking serious and important in his custom-tailored suits. He would return late at night, long after Marcus was asleep, exhausted from the demands of his empire. When kids at school, their eyes wide with awe, would ask what his dad did, Marcus would simply say, "He's in business." And he used to play a little basketball. What Marcus didn't know was that his father's identity, the very name that was a source of pride and wonder, was about to become the most critical detail of his young life. Just 4 houses down from Dolores's place, at 251 Rosewood Drive, lived Karen White, and she was the embodiment of everything wrong with suburban America, a toxic cocktail of entitlement, boredom, and thinly veiled racism, all wrapped up in expensive yoga pants and a perpetual scowl of disapproval. At 45, Karen had crowned herself the queen of the Rosewood Drive Neighborhood Watch, a position she wielded with the tyrannical authority of a tin-pot dictator, using it to make other people's lives a living hell. Karen was married to Richard White, a successful but perpetually absent investment banker who worked such grueling hours that he was barely aware of his wife's daily reign of terror. They had 16-year-old twins, a boy and a girl, who were so mortified by their mother's behavior that they went to great lengths to avoid her, often sneaking friends in through the back door to bypass the inevitable interrogation. But Karen's true obsession wasn't her family. It was the preservation of what she called suburban perfection. Her mornings began not with coffee, but with a ritual that would make a CIA operative proud. She would meticulously review the feeds from her 6-ring cameras, scanning for any sign of imperfection, any deviation from her rigid standards. Then she would log on to the neighborhood Facebook group and the Nextdoor app, her fingers poised to unleash a barrage of complaints about everything from the height of a neighbor's lawn to the presence of a suspicious delivery truck. In Karen's warped mind, property values and neighborhood aesthetics were her personal crusade, a responsibility she took with a dangerous, obsessive seriousness. While Karen was busy playing neighborhood despot, 2 police officers patrolled the area, their minds poisoned by the same twisted worldview. Officers Garrett Blake and Nash Sterling had been partners for 3 years, and in that time, they had cultivated a reputation within the department that should have seen them fired long ago. These were not officers who protected and served with impartiality. Blake and Sterling spent their shifts preying on minority neighborhoods, making unnecessary traffic stops, using excessive force for minor infractions, and, worst of all, trading racist jokes in the privacy of their squad car, convinced they were unheard. During Marcus's first week on Rosewood Drive, he was simply a boy enjoying his summer. He shot hoops in his grandmother's driveway, the rhythmic bounce of the ball a soundtrack to his dreams. He rode his bike around the block, a small figure of pure, unadulterated joy. He waved at neighbors as they passed, his smile genuine and infectious. Most people waved back, charmed by this polite, happy child who had brought a new, vibrant energy to their quiet street. But not Karen. From her living room window, she watched Marcus with the predatory intensity of a hawk stalking its prey. When he dribbled his basketball, she saw loitering. When he walked to the corner store to buy a candy bar, she saw suspicious behavior. When he played with a neighbor's golden retriever, she saw a pattern of concerning activity. By the end of that first week, Karen had already filed her first official complaint with the Homeowners Association. The subject line read, "Ongoing loitering and suspicious behavior by non-resident minor." In the body of the email, she described Marcus as a young male who appears to be engaging in surveillance activities and demanded immediate action to address this clear and present security threat. The HOA president, a reasonable man named Robert Chen, read the complaint with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. He knew Dolores Jordan, knew she was expecting her grandson for the summer, and couldn't fathom what possible threat a 9-year-old boy could pose. He filed the complaint away, hoping it was an isolated incident, a misunderstanding that would resolve itself. But Karen was just getting warmed up. Week 2 brought an escalation that would have been comical if it weren't so deeply sinister. Marcus had a new basketball, a gift from his father, and he loved the crisp, sharp sound it made against the concrete. To him, it was the sound of his future, of his dreams taking flight. To Karen, it was ammunition for her next assault. She called the police non-emergency line, her voice trembling with feigned fear, claiming that the repetitive, loud noises coming from 247 Rosewood Drive sounded like gunshots and were causing her severe anxiety and fear for her safety. She told the dispatcher that she couldn't be sure if it was a basketball or something more dangerous, and that she needed officers to investigate immediately. When the responding officer arrived and found Marcus shooting hoops with his grandmother watching from a rocking chair on the porch, he couldn't help but chuckle. He explained to Dolores that they had received a noise complaint, apologized profusely for the inconvenience, and left, shaking his head at the sheer absurdity of it all. But the complaint was officially logged, a permanent record of Karen's malicious intent. She had created her first paper trail. By week 3, Karen's crusade against Marcus had reached a level of malevolence that was truly shocking. She began a campaign of terror on the Nextdoor app, her posts a masterclass in racist dog whistling. She wrote about concerning gang activity in the neighborhood, mentioned suspected drug dealing near the elementary school, and warned her neighbors to stay vigilant about suspicious individuals who don't belong in our community. She never mentioned Marcus by name, but her descriptions were so specific as clothing, his approximate age, even the times of day he was most often outside, that anyone who had seen him knew exactly who she was targeting. She was, in essence, creating a digital wanted poster for a 9-year-old child whose only crime was being black in her neighborhood. The comments on her posts were a toxic mix of reasonable neighbors asking for more specific information, and a handful of others who shared her prejudices, chiming in with their own observations. Karen was building an army of paranoia, one racist neighbor at a time. What made this all the more sinister was that Karen knew precisely what she was doing. She was crafting a narrative, building a case, meticulously documenting a pattern of behavior that existed only in her twisted, hate-filled imagination. Every complaint, every post, every phone call was a calculated move in a campaign designed to drive Marcus and his family out of her neighborhood. It was a Tuesday evening, the sun beginning its slow descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across Rosewood Drive. 9-year-old Marcus, having finished his summer reading, was doing what he loved most, shooting hoops in his grandmother's driveway. He was completely lost in his own world, practicing the crossover dribble he had seen his father execute countless times in old game tapes, blissfully unaware that he was being watched with the cold, calculating eyes of a predator. Karen had positioned herself at her living room window, a perfect vantage point overlooking Dolores's house. She had been waiting for this moment, biding her time for 3 weeks, building her case, documenting her fictitious complaints, creating her insidious narrative. But today, she was ready to take the action that would change everything. As Marcus dribbled the ball, practicing a move that was a mirror image of his father's, the inevitable happened. The ball, slick with a thin layer of evening dew, got away from him. It bounced off the rim at an awkward angle and rolled toward the street, heading for the storm drain at the end of the driveway. Marcus, with the single-minded focus of a child chasing a beloved toy, jogged after it, his eyes locked on the ball. He snatched it just before it reached the curb, a smile of relief spreading across his face. And that's when he saw her. Karen White was storming across her lawn like a woman possessed, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She moved toward him with an aggressive energy that would have intimidated a grown man, let alone a 9-year-old child. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, her voice a shrill, piercing sound that shattered the evening's tranquility. "I've been watching you, and I know exactly what you're up to." Marcus froze, the basketball clutched tightly to his chest. He was utterly confused by this sudden, unwarranted attack. He had barely interacted with this woman, aside from a few polite waves that had gone unreturned. He had no idea why she was screaming at him. "I'm just playing basketball, ma'am," Marcus replied, his voice small but respectful, just as his parents had taught him to speak to adults. "I live here with my grandmother." But Karen wasn't interested in the truth. She was interested in escalation. "Don't you lie to me," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. She stepped closer, invading his personal space in a way that was undeniably threatening. "I've been watching you for weeks, casing houses. You're looking for something to steal, aren't you? I want to see your ID. Right now." She was demanding identification from a 9-year-old child. Marcus's confusion quickly morphed into fear as this unhinged woman continued her verbal assault. "Ma'am, I don't have an ID. I'm 9 years old. I live right there with my grandma Dolores," he said, pointing to his grandmother's house, where the warm glow of the porch light had just flickered on. That's when Karen's harassment took a much darker, more calculated turn. Instead of backing down when confronted with the simple, obvious truth, she doubled down, her mind concocting a web of lies that would shock even the most jaded observer. "You don't belong in this neighborhood," she screamed, her voice rising to a fever pitch. She followed Marcus as he tried to retreat toward the safety of his grandmother's house. "I know your type. You're here to steal from hardworking, decent families." And then, as Marcus reached the bottom step of his grandmother's porch, Karen did something so premeditated, so diabolical, that it would have devastating consequences for everyone involved. She pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen, as she began to weave a tapestry of lies that would transform a child's innocent game of basketball into a major criminal incident. But before she made the call, a twisted thought clicked into place in her mind. Harassment wasn't enough. Intimidation wasn't working. She needed something bigger, something that would guarantee the police would take her seriously, something that would remove this child from her neighborhood for good. So she began to manufacture evidence out of thin air. "Wait a minute," she said, her voice suddenly taking on a theatrical tone of dawning realization. "I just remembered. My prized garden gnomes, the ones I had imported from Germany, they went missing last week. They were right there, by my mailbox. They were worth over $500, and now they're gone." Marcus stared at her, his mind reeling in bewilderment. He had never even noticed her garden gnomes, let alone entertained the thought of taking them. But Karen was just getting started, her lies growing more elaborate and audacious with each passing second. "And my packages," she continued, her voice filled with fabricated outrage. "I've had packages delivered that were tampered with, opened. I'm sure I saw you lurking around my porch last weekend, looking into my car windows." Each accusation was more outrageous than the last, but Karen was building to a crescendo, a grand finale that would turn this campaign of harassment into a felony case. She was about to accuse a 9-year-old child of crimes that could tarnish his future before it had even begun. With Marcus standing on his grandmother's porch, terrified and utterly confused, Karen dialed 911. She was about to deliver a performance that would have made Meryl Streep jealous, but this wasn't a movie. This was a calculated, malicious attempt to destroy a child's life, fueled by the poison of systemic racism and the arrogance of white privilege. And what she said during that call was so shocking, so utterly devoid of truth, that it would send a chill down the spine of any decent human being. 911, what is your emergency? Yes, this is Karen White at 251 Rosewood Drive. There's a black male, he appears to be in his late teens, who has been robbing houses in our neighborhood for weeks. Late teens. She had just described a 9-year-old boy as a teenager, a deliberate choice to make him sound more threatening, more dangerous. He just tried to break into several cars on our street, and when I confronted him about the recent thefts, he became violent and threatening towards me. I'm a single woman, here all alone, and I am terrified for my life. A single woman. She was married with 2 teenage children, but she knew that portraying herself as a lone, vulnerable woman would elicit a faster, more aggressive response. I think he might have a weapon. He keeps reaching into his pockets and making threatening gestures. I need officers here immediately, before he hurts someone or steals more property. A weapon. Threatening gestures. She was describing a child holding a basketball as an armed and dangerous criminal. The 911 operator, trained to take every call seriously, began dispatching officers immediately, the urgency in her voice reflecting the severity of Karen's fabricated claims. Ma'am, can you describe the suspect for me? Yes, He's a black male, approximately 17 or 18 years old, wearing a basketball jersey. He's tall, maybe 6 feet, and he's acting very aggressively towards the residents here. 6 feet tall, 18 years old, aggressive. Every single detail was a deliberate, calculated lie, designed to ensure that the responding officers would arrive on the scene expecting to confront a dangerous adult criminal, not a 9-year-old child playing basketball. But while Karen was spinning her web of deceit to the 911 operator, something was happening on Dolores Jordan's porch that would alter the course of the evening, and indeed, the lives of everyone involved. Marcus, scared and confused but remembering his parents' instructions, did exactly what he had been taught to do in a situation like this. He called for help. First, he tried his mother, but the call went straight to voicemail. She was on a different continent, in a different time zone. Then, with trembling fingers, he made the call that would change everything, though no one, least of all Karen White, could have possibly realized it at the time. "Dad?" Marcus's voice was shaking, the full weight of the situation finally crashing down on him. "That neighbor lady, she's yelling at me again, and she's calling the police," he whispered into the phone, his words tumbling out in a rush of fear and confusion. "She's saying I stole things, Dad, but I didn't steal anything. I'm scared." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line as Marcus listened to his father's voice, a voice that could command the attention of millions, now focused solely on him. I know, hands visible. Stay calm. Wait for you." Marcus listened intently, his father's calm, steady voice a lifeline in the swirling chaos of the evening. "I'm scared, Dad. She's telling them I'm dangerous, but I was just playing basketball." "Okay, I understand. I love you too. I'm on my way, son." His father's voice was low, but it held a steely resolve that could cut through diamonds. "And when I get there, every single person involved in this is going to learn exactly who they're dealing with. What happened next on Rosewood Drive will make your blood boil and lay bare the ugly, insidious workings of systemic racism in America. Because when officers Garrett Blake and Nash Sterling received that 911 call, they weren't just responding to a report. They were responding to their own deeply ingrained prejudices. And they were about to turn those prejudices into a living nightmare that would traumatize a child and expose the rotten core of police bias. The squad car screamed down Rosewood Drive, its sirens blaring and lights flashing, as if they were responding to a full-blown active shooter situation. Blake, the senior officer, a man with a dozen complaints for excessive force languishing in his file, was already priming his partner before they even arrived on the scene. "Sounds like another one of these punks who thinks he can just come into a decent neighborhood and steal from hardworking people," Blake grumbled, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his service weapon. "These kids need to be taught a lesson that there are consequences for their actions." Sterling, younger and eager to impress his racist mentor, nodded in fervent agreement. "Yeah, and the fact that he's still on the scene means he's either really stupid or really dangerous. Either way, we're going to show him what happens when you mess with our neighborhood." Our neighborhood. As if Rosewood Drive belonged to them, and not the diverse tapestry of people who actually live there. When they stepped out of their patrol car, Blake and Sterling had already convicted Marcus in the court of their own prejudice. They didn't arrive to investigate a crime. They arrived to arrest a criminal. The only problem was that the criminal was a 9-year-old child, clutching a basketball to his chest as if it were a shield. But that minor detail didn't matter to them. "Put your hands where we can see them," Blake screamed at Marcus, his voice a weapon in itself. He advanced on the boy, his hand hovering menacingly over his gun, as if he were confronting a hardened felon on America's Most Wanted, not a child standing on his own grandmother's porch. "Get on the ground now." Marcus, terrified but desperately trying to follow his parents' instructions, slowly raised his hands and began to comply. But before he could even process the command, Sterling was behind him, roughly grabbing his small arms and forcing him to the ground, his face scraping against the rough concrete of the steps. "I didn't do anything wrong," Marcus cried out, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and confusion. "I live here with my grandmother. I was just playing basketball." That's when Blake delivered a line that would come to haunt him, a line that dripped with the callous indifference of a man who had long since lost his humanity. "Shut up, we'll do the talking here." A police officer telling a terrified 9-year-old child to shut up. Let that sink in. Sterling, not to be outdone, chimed in with his own contribution to this disgraceful spectacle. "You match the description of a robbery suspect. You're under arrest." But here's the detail that will make you sick to your stomach. Marcus didn't match any description, except for the one that mattered most to these officers. She was black. The late teens, 6-foot-tall suspect that Karen had so vividly described to the 911 operator bore absolutely no resemblance to the small, frightened 9-year-old boy they were now treating like a dangerous, violent criminal. And that's when Karen, seeing her plan coming to fruition, stepped onto the stage to deliver what can only be described as an Academy Award-worthy performance of feigned victimhood. "Thank God you're here," she cried, rushing toward the officers, tears appearing on command as if from a hidden reservoir of crocodile tears. "That's him. That's the boy who's been terrorizing our neighborhood." She pointed at Marcus with the dramatic flair of someone identifying a serial killer in a police lineup, not a child who had been playing basketball in his own driveway. "He stole my garden decorations. They were worth over $500, she sobbed, laying it on thick for the officers, who were eagerly lapping up every word. "And my packages? I had over $1,000 worth of packages stolen right off my porch. I'm sure it was him." But Karen was just getting started, her lies spiraling into a vortex of pure fantasy. "He broke into my garage and stole hundreds of dollars worth of tools," she continued, each accusation more elaborate and outrageous than the last. "And I've seen him, watching my house at night, casing it, planning his next robbery." The officers didn't ask for a shred of evidence. They didn't question the timeline. They didn't bother to wonder how a 9-year-old child could possibly carry hundreds of dollars worth of tools. They simply believed every single word, because it confirmed the racist narrative they had already constructed in their minds. "Do you have any of this on camera?" Sterling asked, a glimmer of excitement in his eyes, as he imagined building an airtight case. "Absolutely," Karen lied without a moment's hesitation. "I have it all recorded on my Ring camera. The theft, the threats, everything." Of course, she had no such recordings, because none of these crimes had ever actually occurred. But the officers didn't bother to verify her claims. They were too busy preparing to arrest a child, based solely on the word of a woman whose blinding hatred had driven her to commit a felony. Meanwhile, Dolores Jordan, having heard the commotion, came rushing outside to find her grandson being treated like a criminal on her own front porch. This elegant, dignified woman, who had lived on Rosewood Drive for 30 years and knew every neighbor by name, tried to intervene. "Officers, there has been a terrible mistake," she said, her voice calm but firm, laced with an authority that came from a lifetime of grace and resilience. "This is my grandson, Marcus Jordan. He lives here with me. He is 9 years old, and he has never stolen a single thing in his life." But Blake and Sterling were not interested in hearing from someone who could dismantle their carefully constructed narrative. "Ma'am, you need to step back," Blake ordered, his tone dismissive and disrespectful. "We are conducting an official investigation here." "But I can show you his school registration," Dolores persisted, trying to provide the evidence that would clear up this obvious and horrifying misunderstanding. "I have his birth certificate, his medical records, proof that he lives here." Sterling cut her off with a callousness that would make your blood boil. "We know your type. You'll say anything to protect him. This kid doesn't belong in a neighborhood like this." "Your type." He said that to Dolores Jordan, a woman who was a pillar of her community, a woman of immense grace and dignity. Other neighbors, drawn by the flashing lights and the escalating commotion, were beginning to emerge from their houses. Mrs. Santos, an elderly woman from across the street, approached the officers, her face a mask of concern, in a brave attempt to defend Marcus. "Officers, I have watched this child for 3 weeks, she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He is the most polite, respectful boy I have ever met. He helps me carry my groceries. He always waves and says, "Good morning." There is no way he has stolen anything from anyone. But the officers had already made their decision, and they weren't about to let facts or the testimony of a respected community member get in the way of their prejudice. "Save it for the judge, kid," Blake sneered at Marcus, as if a 9-year-old were somehow responsible for the testimony of the adults who were trying to defend him. What happened next will show you exactly how a child's calm, respectful demeanor can be twisted and contorted by racist officers into evidence of guilt. Despite being terrified, despite being treated like a hardened criminal, despite having 2 grown men with guns screaming at him, Marcus maintained the composure his parents had instilled in him. He continued to politely ask if he could call his father. He provided his correct address when asked. He offered to have his grandmother show them his school ID and his birth certificate. But to Blake and Sterling, Marcus's calm demeanor wasn't a sign of good parenting or strong character. It was suspicious. "This kid's too calm," Blake muttered to his partner, his voice low but audible to those standing nearby. Most guilty kids would be crying their eyes out or trying to run by now. His composure, it makes him look calculating. Sterling nodded in agreement. His eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Yeah, and he keeps asking to call his father. That's what they all do when they get caught. Try to get their family to come up with some kind of alibi." They were literally using a child's respectful, composed behavior as evidence that he was a criminal mastermind. And then, they made the decision that would change everything. "Marcus Jordan," Blake announced, his voice filled with a self-important gravity as he pulled out his handcuffs. "You are under arrest for theft, criminal trespassing, and resisting arrest." Resisting arrest, a charge they had tacked onto a 9-year-old boy who had complied with every single one of their commands, who had never once tried to run or fight back. As they prepared to shove Marcus into the back of their patrol car, handcuffed like a common criminal, he made one last desperate plea. "My father is on his way," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tears that were now streaming down his face. "Please, just wait for him. He can explain everything." And that's when Blake delivered the line that would soon come back to haunt him in the most spectacular, career-ending way imaginable. "Your daddy isn't going to be able to save you from this one kid." As they opened the back door of the patrol car, preparing to drive a 9-year-old child to jail based on a foundation of completely fabricated charges, none of them, not Blake, not Sterling, not the smugly satisfied Karen White, had any idea that the person who was at that very moment driving towards Rosewood Drive was someone who would turn their entire world upside down. Because Marcus's daddy wasn't just coming to save him, he was coming to deliver a reckoning, a form of justice so swift and so absolute that it would be talked about for years to come. And when he arrived, the truth about who this family really was would shock everyone into a stunned, horrified silence. The arrest was complete. The lies had been accepted as truth, and a 9-year-old child was about to be driven away from his own home in handcuffs. But in the space of less than 5 minutes, everything these racist officers and the prejudiced woman who had summoned them thought they knew about power, about authority, and about consequences was about to be shattered in the most dramatic and spectacular way imaginable. And then, just as Blake was about to slide into the driver's seat and drive away with Marcus in the back of his patrol car, something happened that would change the course of the evening, and indeed, the rest of their lives. A low, powerful rumble echoed through the quiet streets of Rosewood Drive, a sound that was distinctly out of place in this neighborhood of sensible sedans and family-friendly SUVs. A sleek, black, custom-built Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon, its windows tinted to an impenetrable darkness, turned onto the street, its powerful engine a low growl of impending authority. It moved with a speed and purpose that made everyone on Rosewood Drive stop and take notice. The G-Wagon pulled up to the scene, parking directly behind the squad car, effectively blocking its exit. Blake and Sterling exchanged a look of smug satisfaction, assuming that this was some high-ranking supervisor, perhaps a captain or a deputy chief, arriving to commend them for their excellent police work. "Finally," Blake muttered to his partner, a self-satisfied smirk spreading across his face. Looks like the department is finally taking this kind of crime seriously. Probably sending a supervisor to make sure we handle this high-profile arrest by the book." Sterling nodded in agreement, straightening his uniform and preparing to deliver a glowing report to whoever was about to emerge from the formidable vehicle. They were proud of their work that day. In their twisted, prejudiced minds, they had just prevented a major crime wave and apprehended a dangerous suspect who had been terrorizing an innocent, hard-working neighborhood. They had no idea that the person who was about to step out of that G-Wagon was about to systematically dismantle their careers, their reputations, and their entire understanding of the world. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a casual but obviously expensive outfit, and he moved with the easy, athletic grace of a man who was completely comfortable in his own skin. He radiated an aura of such immense power and authority that it seemed to suck all the air out of the surrounding atmosphere. But it wasn't his expensive clothes or his powerful physique that struck everyone first. It was his face. A face that was instantly, globally recognizable. A face that had been on countless magazine covers, billboards, and television screens for decades. A face that belonged to a living legend. Michael Jordan stood there, his eyes, cold and hard as diamonds, taking in the entire scene with the methodical precision of a predator assessing its prey. He saw the flashing lights of the police car, the small, huddled group of neighbors, the smug, self-satisfied woman standing on her lawn, and his two officers, who were suddenly looking very, very uncomfortable. And he saw his son, his 9-year-old son, standing by the police car, his small wrists bound in cold, hard steel. Blake and Sterling's satisfaction instantly evaporated, replaced by a wave of nervous confusion. This wasn't a supervisor. This wasn't backup. This was Michael Jordan. And the look on his face told them that this was not a social call. Sterling, his voice betraying the tremor of fear that was now creeping up his spine, was the first to speak. "Mr. Jordan, we weren't expecting. We have this situation under control, sir." But Michael Jordan didn't respond with the polite acknowledgement they might have expected. Instead, he continued to survey the scene, his jaw tight, his eyes missing nothing. He looked at his son, then at the officers, then at Karen White, his gaze lingering on her for a moment, with an intensity that made her physically recoil. "Give me your report," Michael Jordan said, his voice low and quiet, yet it carried an authority that made the two armed police officers stand at attention. "I want to know exactly what happened here, and I want every single detail." Blake, desperately trying to regain some semblance of his professional composure, launched into what he thought was a concise and professional summary of their successful police work. "Sir, we responded to a 911 call about a robbery suspect in the neighborhood. The complainant, Miss Scribley Day White, identified this individual," he said, gesturing towards Marcus, "as someone who had stolen multiple items from her property over the course of several weeks. When we arrived on the scene, the suspect matched the description provided, and the victim positively identified him as the perpetrator." Michael Jordan listened without a single flicker of expression, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "Continue." Sterling, eager to demonstrate his thoroughness, jumped in. "The suspect was uncooperative, sir. He kept trying to distract us by asking to call someone. We determined that he was attempting to establish an alibi, so we proceeded with the arrest for theft, criminal trespassing, and resisting arrest." "Resisting arrest?" Michael Jordan's voice was now laced with a hint of ice. "What, exactly, did my 9-year-old son do to resist arrest?" The two officers exchanged a nervous glance, the foundation of their story suddenly feeling a lot less solid than it had just a few moments before. "Well, sir, he was uncooperative. He kept asking questions instead of immediately following our commands." Before Michael Jordan could respond, Karen White, completely oblivious to the seismic shift in power that had just occurred, decided that this was her moment to shine. She had no idea who this imposing man was, other than a celebrity, but she could see that he commanded the respect of the officers, and she was determined to make sure her version of events was heard by someone with real influence. "Thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed, approaching Michael Jordan with the overconfident swagger of someone who believed they were about to be vindicated by the highest authority. Someone with some real clout. This criminal has been terrorizing our neighborhood for weeks." Michael Jordan slowly turned his attention to Karen, and she, mistaking his silence for encouragement, launched into the performance of her lifetime. "I have evidence witnesses everything you need to put him away for a very long time," she declared, gesturing dramatically towards Marcus. "He has stolen over $2,000 worth of property from my home alone, imported garden gnomes, designer packages, expensive power tools. He has been systematically robbing our entire neighborhood." She was building to her grand crescendo now, completely unaware of the way Michael Jordan's jaw was tightening with every word she spoke. "I have seen him, with my own 2 eyes, watching my house at night, casing it, planning his next robbery. He threatened me when I confronted him. I have it all on my Ring camera. This boy is a menace, and he does not belong in a neighborhood like ours." Michael Jordan listened to every single word, his expression unchanging. To Karen, this looked like a thorough, professional investigation that would undoubtedly prove her right. She had no idea that she was not providing evidence for a prosecution, but for her own downfall. And then Michael Jordan turned back to his officers, his voice still quiet, but now with a dangerous edge that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. "So, you arrested my son based solely on this woman's accusations? No physical evidence? No investigation of her claims? No verification of these alleged crimes?" Blake, a cold sweat now trickling down his back, tried to defend their actions. "Well, sir, she seemed very credible, and he fit the description she provided to dispatch." That's when Michael Jordan asked the question that would change everything, the question that would detonate the entire situation like a bomb. What description? The one of the 6-foot-tall, 18-year-old armed man, or the one of the 9-year-old boy holding a basketball? The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. Blake and Sterling looked as if they had been physically struck. Karen's mouth fell open, the color draining from her face as if a plug had been pulled. The neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle began to understand that they had just witnessed something that would alter their community forever. Michael Jordan walked over to where his son was standing, still handcuffed, still trying to process the surreal nightmare that had become his life. And for the first time since he had arrived on the scene, his professional, intimidating mask slipped just for a moment, revealing the raw, unfiltered emotion of a father. "Son," he said, his voice gentle and filled with a love that was a stark contrast to the authority he had shown just moments before. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" Marcus just shook his head, the relief in his eyes so profound it was palpable to everyone watching. This child, who had been treated like a hardened criminal for the past hour, was finally being spoken to like a human being, like a child, by someone in a position of power. Michael Jordan stood up and turned back to the group of officers and neighbors who were all watching this interaction with a mixture of growing confusion and dawning horror. "Officers Blake and Sterling," he said, his voice returning to its official, authoritative tone. "The dangerous criminal you just arrested for robbery, trespassing, and resisting arrest is my son." The words landed with the force of a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of onlookers. Blake and Sterling looked as if they were about to be physically sick, their faces a pale shade of green. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no sound came out. The neighbors who had gathered to watch the arrest began to understand that they had just witnessed a miscarriage of justice of epic proportions. And then, the explosion of realization began. Karen was the first to break the stunned silence, her voice a high-pitched squeak of disbelief as she tried to process what she had just heard. That's impossible. How was I supposed to know?" Michael Jordan's response was delivered with the cold, cutting precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Know what, Ms. White? That you shouldn't file a false police report? That you shouldn't invent crimes that never happened? That you shouldn't accuse a 9-year-old child of being a hardened criminal based on the color of his skin?" Blake, his entire career flashing before his eyes, tried desperately to salvage the situation. Chief, Mr. Jordan, we had no idea. We were just following protocol. We responded to a legitimate 911 call. But Michael Jordan cut him off with a question that exposed the rotten core of their police work. Protocol for what? For arresting a 9-year-old for playing basketball? Protocol for believing a series of increasingly outlandish accusations without a shred of evidence? Protocol for treating my son like a dangerous animal because a racist woman with a grudge told you to? Sterling, now visibly sweating, attempted his own pathetic defense. Sir, we couldn't have known. The complainant, she seemed so credible. We were just doing our job. Your job? Michael Jordan's voice was rising now, a controlled fury that was far more terrifying than any shouting. Your job is to serve and protect all members of this community. Your job is to investigate crimes, not to participate in the racist targeting of a child. Your job is to use your brains, your training, and what little humanity you have left, not to act as the personal enforcement arm of suburban bigotry. The truth was now laid bare for everyone to see. Blake and Sterling hadn't arrested a criminal. They had participated in the racist persecution of a child whose only crime was existing while black in a neighborhood where he had every right to be. Karen White hadn't reported a series of crimes. She had committed a series of crimes by filing false police reports and lying to law enforcement. And the 9-year-old boy they had handcuffed and were about to take to jail was the son of one of the most powerful and influential men on the planet. As the full, crushing weight of their actions began to sink in, everyone on Rosewood Drive understood that this single moment would define the rest of their lives. For Blake and Sterling, it meant the end of their careers, and very likely, criminal charges. For Karen White, it meant facing the devastating consequences of her racist lies in a way she could never have possibly imagined. But for Marcus Jordan, it meant something even more profound. It was the moment that justice, in its most powerful and undeniable form, arrived exactly when he needed it most, delivered by the one person he knew he could always count on, his father. The man who had taught him to stay calm, to be respectful, and to always trust that in the end, the truth would prevail. The revelation was complete. The truth had been exposed. And now, it was time for a reckoning, a series of consequences that would shake this community to its very foundation. And now, it was time for consequences. Real, tangible, life-altering consequences. The kind that would follow everyone involved for the rest of their days. A permanent and indelible reminder that actions have repercussions, that lies have a price, and that racism carries a cost that extends far beyond the fleeting moment of its expression. Michael Jordan stood in the middle of Rosewood Drive, a towering figure of righteous fury amidst the wreckage of what these people had considered a routine evening. And he began to deliver justice with the methodical, calculated precision of a man who understood exactly how to wield the immense power he possessed. He addressed his officers first, and his words, delivered in a low, even tone, would echo through the halls of the police department for years to come. Officers Blake and Sterling, he said, his voice carrying the undeniable weight of absolute authority. You arrested my 9-year-old son without a shred of probable cause, based on a series of fabricated claims, and you used excessive force against a child. You failed to conduct even the most basic, rudimentary investigation. You willfully ignored the testimony of witnesses who could have de-escalated this entire situation immediately. You have violated your oath, your training, and every single principle of ethical, compassionate policing. Blake and Sterling stood there like condemned men awaiting their sentence. The color drained from their faces, the full magnitude of their catastrophic error in judgment crashing down upon them. They knew, with a sickening certainty, that their careers were over. I want you to report to Internal Affairs first thing Monday morning, Michael Jordan continued, his voice as cold and hard as steel. You will be facing a full investigation for police misconduct, violation of civil rights, and a complete and utter failure to perform your duties in accordance with department policy. This incident will be thoroughly and painstakingly investigated, and I can personally guarantee you that justice will be served. But he wasn't finished with them, not by a long shot. Then, Michael Jordan turned his attention to Karen White, who was still standing on her lawn, frozen in a state of shock, desperately trying to process how her perfectly executed plan had devolved into her worst nightmare. "Ma'am," he said, his tone shifting from authoritative to something far more formal and intimidating, "filing a false police report is a felony in this state. Fabricating crimes that never occurred, lying about thousands of dollars of stolen property, wasting valuable police resources with your manufactured emergencies. These are serious criminal offenses that carry significant prison time." The last vestiges of color drained from Karen's face as the reality of her situation finally began to penetrate her bubble of privilege. This was no longer about neighborhood drama or a petty grudge. This was about state and federal crimes, felonies that could utterly destroy her life, her reputation, and her family. But Karen, true to her nature, was not yet ready to accept responsibility for her actions. Instead, she launched into a desperate, pathetic series of excuses, her words a transparent attempt to absolve herself of blame. "This is all just a huge misunderstanding," she pleaded, her voice rising to a high-pitched squeak that bordered on hysteria. "I was just trying to protect my neighborhood. I felt threatened. I genuinely thought I was doing the right thing. It was just a mistake," she continued, grasping at any straw that might save her from the consequences of her malicious actions. "How was I supposed to know who he was? I was just trying to be a good, vigilant neighbor." Michael Jordan listened to every excuse with the infinite patience of a man who had heard every conceivable variation of these self-serving lies throughout his long and storied career. And then he delivered a response that would haunt Karen White for the rest of her life. He pulled out his phone and, in a clear, steady voice, began to read from the official transcript of her 911 call, his words echoing through the now silent street for everyone to hear. "There's a black male, he appears to be in his late teens, who has been robbing houses in our neighborhood. He just tried to break into several cars, and when I confronted him, he became violent and threatening towards me. I think he might have a weapon." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, each one a testament to her calculated, deliberate deceit. Everyone listening understood, with a chilling clarity, that this was not a mistake. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a calculated, malicious lie, designed to get a child arrested, or worse. But Michael Jordan wasn't finished. He then began to read from her social media posts, the ones she had been posting for the past 3 weeks, the ones that described gang activity and drug dealing in connection with a 9-year-old boy playing basketball. "You claimed my son stole items from your property worth over $2,000, Michael Jordan said, his voice growing harder, colder with each word. "That is grand larceny. You want to file a police report, Ms. White? Let's file one against you." And that's when the community, which had been watching in stunned silence, began to find its voice. Mr. Henderson, a contractor who had been working on a house down the street, approached the group, his own phone in his hand. "Mr. Jordan," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of shame and anger, "I have been watching this woman harass your son for weeks. She follows him. She yells at him. She calls him names. I have video of the whole thing." Mrs. Santos, the elderly woman from across the street, stepped forward, tears welling in her eyes. "Mr. Jordan, that little boy is an angel," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "He helps me with my groceries every single week. He always says, 'Good morning, Mrs. Santos,' and asks me how I'm feeling. He would never, ever steal from anyone. This woman, she has been lying about everything." Even the Miller family, who had remained silent throughout Karen's campaign of harassment, finally found the courage to speak the truth. "We should have said something sooner," Mr. Miller admitted, his shame evident in his downcast eyes. "We saw how she was treating Marcus, and we knew it was wrong, but we didn't want to get involved. We are so sorry. That boy doesn't deserve any of this." The evidence was overwhelming. The community testimony was unequivocal. The truth was undeniable. Karen White had systematically harassed, slandered, and attempted to criminalize a child, based on nothing more than her own deep-seated racial prejudice. Blake and Sterling, watching their careers and their lives implode in real time, made one last, desperate attempt to salvage their rapidly sinking ship. "Mr. Jordan, we are so sorry," Blake began, his voice cracking. But Michael Jordan cut him off with a gesture that could have frozen fire. "You don't apologize to me," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that could make grown men tremble. "You apologize to my son. You put a 9-year-old child in handcuffs and treated him like a dangerous criminal. If you have a single shred of decency left in your bodies, you will look him in the eye and apologize for the trauma you have inflicted upon him." But even that was not enough for Michael Jordan. "Your badges and your service weapons. Now." Blake and Sterling, their hands shaking uncontrollably, removed their badges from their uniforms and surrendered their weapons, right there, in the middle of Rosewood Drive, in front of the entire neighborhood. Their careers in law enforcement were over, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing justice being served in real time. Michael Jordan then turned back to Karen White and delivered the final, devastating blow that would end her reign of neighborhood terror for good. "Ms. White, you will be facing criminal charges for filing a false police report, a felony that carries a sentence of up to 5 years in prison. If you even attempt to file an insurance claim for any of the items you have so brazenly and falsely claimed were stolen, you will also be facing charges of insurance fraud. Your pattern of harassment and cyberstalking on various social media platforms constitutes criminal behavior under state law, and wasting police resources with your fabricated emergency calls is a misdemeanor that carries significant fines and potential jail time." The legal consequences were devastating, but the personal consequences were about to become even worse. Later that evening, as the last of the police cars finally departed from Rosewood Drive and the neighbors retreated to the privacy of their homes, the Jordan family was finally reunited in the safety and comfort of their own house. Michael Jordan, his professional, intimidating mask finally gone, embraced his son with a fierce, protective love that only a parent can truly understand. Juanita, having caught the first available flight back from Europe, rushed home from the airport, her face etched with worry and exhaustion. The family sat together in their living room, processing the trauma of the evening, but also celebrating the incredible strength and dignity that Marcus had shown throughout his terrifying ordeal. "I am so proud of you, son," Michael Jordan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did everything we taught you. You stayed calm. You were respectful. And you trusted that the truth would eventually come out." "But I was scared, Dad," Marcus admitted, finally allowing himself to show the vulnerability he had been so bravely hiding all evening. "Being scared doesn't make you weak," Juanita said, holding her son close. "Being scared and still doing the right thing, that's what makes you brave." But while the Jordan family was beginning the slow process of healing, the consequences for everyone else involved were just beginning. The incident on Rosewood Drive sparked a series of long overdue conversations throughout the neighborhood about racism, about accountability, and about the shared responsibility that comes with living in a diverse and inclusive community. Neighbors who had remained silent during Karen's campaign of harassment began to understand their own complicity in allowing the situation to escalate to such a dangerous and destructive point. Richard White came home from a long day at the office to find police cars in his driveway and his wife facing a litany of felony charges. When he learned the full, unvarnished truth of what Karen had done, when he understood the depth of her lies and the innocence of the child she had so viciously targeted, he was mortified beyond description. Friends who knew Richard described him as a decent, hard-working man who had been completely oblivious to his wife's racist and destructive behavior. Word quickly spread through the neighborhood that he had consulted a divorce attorney. The Homeowners Association held an emergency meeting and unanimously voted to remove Karen from all positions of authority, including her self-appointed role as the coordinator of the Neighborhood Watch. They issued a formal public apology to the Jordan family and immediately began to implement new policies designed to prevent the harassment of residents based on race, age, or any other protected characteristic. Karen's own children were so deeply embarrassed and ashamed by their mother's actions that they refused to speak to her. Their friends at school had seen the social media posts. They had heard about the arrest, and they understood exactly what kind of person their mother truly was. The criminal charges were filed within a week. Karen White was officially charged with filing a false police report, a felony that could see her spend up to 5 years in prison. The district attorney's office made it clear that they intended to prosecute her to the fullest extent of the law, sending a powerful and unequivocal message that using the police as a weapon of racial harassment would not be tolerated in their jurisdiction. Blake and Sterling were suspended without pay, pending the results of a full internal affairs investigation. But everyone in the department knew that their careers in law enforcement were over. The department announced a series of new training protocols and accountability measures, specifically designed to prevent similar incidents of racial profiling and the use of excessive force. And in the end, justice was served in the most visible and satisfying way possible. 3 months later, on a warm, sun-drenched Saturday afternoon, Marcus Jordan was back on the basketball court in his grandmother's driveway. But this time, he wasn't alone. Children from all over the neighborhood, Black, white, Latino, Asian hot, joined him for a series of pickup games that lasted until the sun began to set. Mrs. Santos brought out lemonade and a large tray of homemade cookies. Mr. Henderson, a former college player himself, taught the kids a few new moves. The Miller family, their faces still etched with a hint of shame, apologized directly to Marcus and invited him to their son's upcoming birthday party. Michael Jordan watched from the living room window, a small, proud smile on his face. He was proud of his son's resilience, proud of his strength, and amazed by the community's capacity to heal, to learn, and to grow from this traumatic and ugly experience. Karen White was nowhere to be seen. She had moved out of the neighborhood in disgrace, her house sold at a loss, her life in ruins. She was facing a lengthy and public trial, abandoned by her family, and ostracized by a community that had finally seen her for who she truly was. The truth had surfaced. Justice had been delivered. And a 9-year-old boy, who had done nothing wrong except exist while black in America, had been vindicated by a system that, for once, had worked exactly as it was supposed to. Because sometimes, just sometimes, the truth has a way of rising to the surface. Injustice has a way of finding and consuming those who seek to pervert it. And when it does, it serves as a powerful reminder to us all that courage, dignity, and doing the right thing will always, in the end, triumph over hatred, lies, and the flagrant abuse of power.